Okay, we're recording. As far as I can see, everything working great. So here we go. Under the Night Sky, Adventures in Landscape Astrophotography. First, I'm going to go through our topics for tonight, and then we'll jump into the presentation. I should say at the beginning, thanks everybody for showing up, and hopefully this will be an informative evening for you. So contents, I'm going to go over definition, what is landscape astrophotography? I'm going to talk about Wally Pacholka, who we'll get to in a second, but he's a very important figure in landscape astrophotography. I'm going to talk about personal safety while you're trying to take these kinds of pictures, talk about photographic challenges that are a little bit unique to this genre of picture taking, talk about the equipment you'll need to be successful, camera settings, just a tiny bit about post-production, because that's not, we don't really have enough time to go into that in detail. But I'm just going to give you a few hints. And then we're going to get into some examples. And I am going to show a case study of the picture I shot 12 days ago right here in the Conejo Valley, and how, I figured out that that would be feasible, and the kind of camera settings I used, and other questions. So, what is landscape astrophotography? Uh, Astrophotography is an image of the sky at night. Landscape is obviously stuff on the ground, whether it be mountains or bushes or the ocean. And you combine the two into a hopefully interesting image, and you have a landscape astrophotograph. This is an example of a landscape astrophotograph taken at the racetrack in Death Valley. So we have the moving rocks on the ground, and this is in October, I think. So the Milky Way was pretty much vertical, as it would be that time of year. So stuff on the ground and a picture of the sky at night, landscape astrophotography. Wally Pacholka. So Wally Pacholka is the pretty much the godfather of landscape astrophotography. Back in the 80s and 90s, he was an accountant, and he gave that up and began converting a hobby into an occupation, and started taking night sky pictures full time. He popularized the genre itself, and more importantly, how to do it. So the beginning of my interest in this branch of photography goes back to the early, I guess we call the last decade the teenies, but 2010 or 2011. And completely by coincidence, I was having dinner with a friend in the lodge in Sequoia National Park. And somebody wandered around all the tables in the dining room and introduced herself and said, "Hey, I'm a member of Friends of Sequoia National Park, and we're having a special presentation tonight that we didn't know anything about." So my friend wanted to get some rest, so he went to bed, and I said, "Well, I'll give it a whirl." And it was Wally Pacholka who was the speaker, and he spent about an hour and a half showing his pictures and how he puts them together, and of course trying to sell his images and some other things. But that's really where I decided this was kind of a cool thing to do. And he was an educator as well as a popularizer, and I learned a lot and started from there. He has been on, he's really, or was really getting known, or is really getting known for night sky photos in the national parks. So he's made pioneering images in many of the national parks, been published in Life magazine, among other well-known publications. If you want to see his stuff, www.astropix.com. Personal safety. So this is, it's a little bit different than shooting animals from a safe place or studio shots. You're going to be out in the field at nighttime, often alone, unless you can find somebody else to do this with. So you need to take sensible precautions, be familiar with the area, if at all possible, have gone to the area in the daytime and looked it over and figured out where and how you're going to shoot. Ideally, pick spots that have easy, straightforward access. That isn't always possible, but that would be nice. For example, if you can shoot from a spot where you can park your car, that's perfect. Use hiking poles, use headlamps, and Don't make the mistake that James Franco did in 127 hours, and make sure there's a contact available at home if in case there's some kind of an emergency and you don't turn up. So safety, very important to pay attention to all these things. Photography challenges. And I'm going to talk about two items, Milky Way versus star trails. So Milky Way, you're going to be photographing very dim objects, so you need high ISO, long exposures, which means you're going to have noise in your images. Stars move, so that's a constraint on your exposure time. Depending on how wide your lens is, you're going to see noticeable, if you're around 20, 24, 30 millimeters, you can maybe get by with a 20-second exposure, but even with that, you'll see, at least on the borders of your pictures, some smearing of the stars. So if possible, try and stay with 15 seconds. But you can't, to set your camera to a low ISO and a really long exposure, you can't do that because your stars are going to be smeared. You need lots of light in a short period of time. So that says a wide aperture, but the wide apertures can result in somewhat shorter depth of field. So depending on how you want to compose your image, that can be a problem. So these are all solvable things, but they're challenges that you should be aware of and will need to overcome. Star trails, again, very long exposures is going to have noise, but helpfully, and same point about the wide aperture, you're going to wind up with shorter depths of field. So these are problems that you need to be able to solve and overcome in this type of photography. So I'm going to stop here. Any questions so far? Just unmute and hopefully do it one at a time, and I'll try and answer. If not, if I don't hear anybody in 15 seconds, I'm going to move on.
Hey, Pete.
Yes.
Is it possible you could move just a bit closer to the mic?
Oh, okay. I'm right next to it, but let me turn it up, Steve. Somebody say something.
That's better.
Okay. I spent $25 when I started doing Zoom conference calls, both with the family and for this kind of thing. I spent $25 on a new headset at Staples, and the microphone is just terrible. So I'm probably going to have to get a new one at some point. Anyway, no other questions? Okay. I'm going to move on to equipment. So we need ideally a low noise body. And I would say any camera that is ideally full frame or has at least a reasonably large sensor on a crop frame camera that's been manufactured in the last 2 years is probably going to fit the bill. But you would be pushing a boulder uphill to use a camera that's 6 years old with not large pixels. So low noise body. If you don't own this stuff to get started, you can always rent it from lensrental.com or borrow lenses. A very fast lens. So ideally for me is 24 millimeter fixed f1.4. And I'm going to talk more about lenses on a future slide. Or other fixed lenses. So I know that you can get an f1.4 35 millimeter. You can get an f1.4 20 millimeter. So those are good choices. And for star trails, this is less critical. But for Milky Way shots, having a wide aperture, f1.4 or f1.8 worst case, is very important. So lenses, these are some types of lenses. When I first put this deck together about 6 years ago, the selection of lenses was much more limited than it is now. So I actually listed the manufacturers on this slide, but there's been an explosion of people making the appropriate kinds of lenses. So I'm just going to describe them generically. So a 28 millimeter f1.8 is nice. Your lowest cost entry lens into something like this is a 50 millimeter f1.8. The 50 millimeters is a little challenging for Milky Way shots because you might not have a wide enough field of view, but you could always shoot multiple exposures at different spots and then stitch them together. And I know with Canon, I think you can get a lens like this for like $125. So that's to get in cheaply. That's a nice choice, and that's a prime lens like that at 50 millimeters is a nice thing to have in your bag under any circumstances. You can get a 50 millimeter f1.4, a 24 f1.4, a 20 f1.4, and not sure if there's any other lenses that are stay at the magic f1.4 that are wider than 20, but these are all good choices. To give you a feel for cost, I think Sigma's 24 millimeter f1.4 is going for around $800 now. So they're, by the standards of good lenses, these are sort of moderately expensive. But for Milky Way shots, you pretty much need something like this. For star trails or just star shots with a foreground illuminated by the moon, a 2.8 zoom or even an f4 zoom is probably enough light to take care of those situations. But for Milky Ways, you need those gigantic apertures. Whatever lens you get, if you want to do this, it has to have a focus scale. So you can manually focus the lens, which you're going to have to do at nighttime. So some of the more inexpensive lenses in this variety might not have a focus scale. So make sure your lens does. Other equipment, you need a tripod, an intervalometer with for star trails, a cable release. A light pollution filter can help if you're shooting in an area with a lot of ambient light. Hoya Starscape is an example. Headlamp with a red bulb so your eyes don't lose their dark adaptation. And again, going a little bit back to safety, warm clothing and boots so you don't hurt your feet, and so protective gear. And again, you're hiking at night, or walking at night. I would strongly urge that you do this with hiking poles. Okay, focus. This not getting your stars in focus is the biggest downfall for people when they first start shooting astrophotography pictures. And you'll fiddle with your lens and you'll look in your viewfinder if you've taken a picture. You'll think your stars are in focus, and you'll get home and put them on a bigger monitor and find out you didn't focus your stars. So there's two ways you can assure that you get your stars focused when you're out in the field. You can put your camera in live view and zoom into 10x and find a relatively bright star and take your focus dial and rotate it left and right. And you'll see that your stars kind of expand into blobs and then disappear. And then you rotate in the other direction and you'll see they rotate to points. And if you keep going, they'll expand into blobs again. So you look for the focus when your stars are nice points and your stars are in focus. So, and it'll take some fiddling, and it can be a little awkward to, crunch over and peer through your live view unless you're fortunate enough to have a fully articulated rear screen. But that's one way to do it. Live view, zoom in, and get your stars to points by manipulating your focus wheel. They got to be points, not discs. Another way to do this is you focus during the daytime on a distant mountain or something. And again, because your lens has a focus dial, you memorize where it obtained the focus, or you shoot a picture of that spot with your cell phone so you can reproduce it at nighttime. And some people will take a piece of tape and just mark it with a pen so you know where to put your focus mark. So that's, and that, the live view zoomed is probably your best bet, but this way works okay too. One way or the other, though, you have to be prepared to do this. And as I said, it is a big stumbling block for people when they first start this. And then, sorry, on this focus during the daytime, just rotate your focus dial back into the right spot at nighttime. Lighting your foreground. So there are some challenges here and some choices on how you're going to do this. So if you are at a dark site and no moon, so not really using any foreground lighting, there'll be some ambient light, but not very much. And the reality is you're going to wind up with the distant mountains or whatever your foreground is just black blobs. You can try and back in post, you can try and coax something out of there, but you're going to get a lot of noise. There are some choices that are beyond the scope of this talk about shooting maybe 8 images at very high ISOs, and then going into Photoshop and use a process called stack mode median that produces a brighter noise-free image. But that's a lot of work, but that is a choice. But generally, you need some way to light your foreground. And there's a couple of choices on this. You can use the moon. So there's a couple of choices here. You can shoot, you can be out in the field and maybe pick a night like actually right now or the next several days where there's a partial moon up that's going to set around, I think tonight it sets around midnight, and make an image of the foreground with the moon up. Wait till the moon goes down and then shoot your Milky Way or star images and then composite them together in post. So, or you can pick a night with a dim moon, like a 30% moon that won't damage your Milky Way too much and just shoot a single exposure. But the moon is a choice on how you light your foreground. You can also light paint, and you can use your headlamp, you can use a flashlight, or for larger, more distant objects, you can use an LED array. And you'll see, I'm going to show some examples of each one of these processes right now, but light painting is definitely a good option. Generally, I find that it takes a lot of shots to get one that you really like. There's a tendency to get too much light close to you and not enough light on whatever foreground object you're trying to illuminate. So, there's one image that I'm going to show you that I probably took 25 or 30 shots before I got one that was lit the way I liked it. But that said, you have nothing else to do, right? You're up in the middle of the night and you can take as many shots as you want until you get one that the lighting on your subject is right. So these are some examples. This is an example of using the moon. So the way this image was made was at near sunset, just before it got dark. I went out and composed this image, set it up on tripod, and plugged in an intervalometer that was set to begin shooting pictures in about 3 hours. And then it shot, I think this is probably either 60 or 90 2-minute exposures. So it's either 2 or 3 hours of star trails. And the reason for the 3-hour delay was shortly after it got dark, the moon came up kind of to the right side of the picture, and then it began to rotate around. I'm obviously looking north here because that's a North Star Trail shot. It rotated around behind me, and then it began to light up the dead tree and the green trees in the foreground. And you can see this is an advantageous way of doing it because everything in the scene is nicely lit. And with light painting, you would have had a lot of difficulty in getting the dead tree appropriately lit and then also the distant trees appropriately lit. So this is an example of using the moon. This is an example of using my headlamp. So it's completely dark. And by the way, note to the right of the tree, the ridge in the background, and it's just, as I was describing earlier, it's just a black blob. And it really would have been a problem to coax any light out of that. And I just used my headlamp and trial and error, took maybe 25 or 30 shots. And I finally got one where the bottom of the tree wasn't too bright and the top too dim and everything seemed just about right. So this is an example of light painting. Then this last image is, by the way, this first two images were at the upper bristlecone pine forest in the White Mountains. This is Shiprock Rock in northwest New Mexico. And in this one, it's not lit by anything I did. And there's no moon. It was completely dark out there. But I'm about behind me to the north, about 10 or 15 miles away, is the town of Shiprock, New Mexico. And there was just enough ambient light coming in that I was able to coax out a reasonable quality image that was kind of interesting lighting shade on this. So, but again, if I'd been 50 miles away from any light source, this would have been very, very dark and hard to have gotten a decent image out of. So this again is just using ambient light. Let's see, I'll take questions. If I'll stop for 15 seconds.
Pete, was that a meteorite?
Well, Carl, it would depend on your point of view. Is it a meteorite or an airplane? I say because a meteorite is cooler, it's a meteorite. But, it's 51% chance at least it's an airplane. But at the time, I thought it was a meteorite, so we'll call it a meteorite for now.
It starts and stops. That's why I thought it was a meteorite.
Well, it's distant. I think that's a 20-second exposure.
Got it.
If the airplane's close, it would go across the whole image.
Right.
But if it's a long ways away, it might only go through that part. Or I don't know. We'll never know. But I'm calling it a meteor.
Me too.
Okay. Any other questions?
So I have a question. This
Yes.
is Kelly. So you take the foreground picture first, and then when you're successful with that, then you take another picture, a time exposure of the Milky Way, and then or the stars, and then you put them together.
Kelly, this is a good question, and I'm going to go back to the images here. So let's go through these. So this image, because I shot, this is actually probably 90 images. What's happening is each time the camera fires, I don't want to get too much on a tangent here, but it's using a calculation routine called brightest pixel. So the reason there's not really any shadows on the dead tree is because at each image, the moon is moved to a slightly different compass position. So the whole tree is, I didn't use, this is not composited. So I just told the computer to take all 90 images and use a program called StarStax to compile it all. And so when it's selecting brightest pixel, it picks the brightest part of the tree in each image and combines them together. So I don't know if you want to call that a single exposure, but I did not, for example, use StarStax to compile the image and then go and grab a single foreground image and put it into the master image. I will get to some examples of where I did do something like that in a few minutes, but this is sort of, technically speaking, a single exposure. So this one is a single exposure. It's just one picture, and I got the tree bright with a headlamp. And this one is also a single exposure. Again, I didn't have to, like sometimes what people will do, Kelly, is they will shoot a picture in the blue hour. So there's just a little bit of illumination on the foreground, and then wait a couple of hours till it gets completely dark. Leave their camera on a tripod and shoot another image of the Milky Way and then composite them together. I might have done that in this situation, but like I say, there was just enough light coming in from the lonely town of Shiprock, New Mexico, that I didn't have to do that. But I will get to a composite image and explain how that can be done in a few minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Anything else? Okay. So planning your shots. So these are things you have to think about. Am I going to use the moon to light my foreground? And on one hand, and also obviously if it's a Milky Way shot, we don't want a bright moon out. And If there is going to be a moon out, we want it to be a small one and to definitely be behind us. So right now the Milky Way is in the south east, and around 1 or 2 or 3 a.m. it's in the southeast, rotating to the south. If there's going to be a moon out, we want it behind us, so more to the north of us. So that's when you're thinking about when do I shoot, you've got to consider what the moon situation is. You've got to consider where in the sky will the Milky Way be relative to a foreground object or the scene that you want to shoot it in, and relative to the moon and considerations like that. So where in the sky will the Milky Way be? Where will the landscape stuff be in relation to the Milky Way or the North Star if you're shooting star trails around the North Star? How do you figure this stuff out? Google Earth is great for looking at maps of places you want to shoot at. There's a program called the Photographer's Ephemeris that is very handy for this kind of thing. Good both satellite photographs or maps of possible areas, topographic maps of possible areas, and it'll show you where the moon's going to be in the sky at any given time of a night on any given day. There's a program called PhotoPills, which is somewhat newer, that is a great program, and we have a screenshot of PhotoPills coming up, and we're privileged to have Roy Patience on the call, the guru, the most guru-ish person I know of PhotoPills. And then you can use just ordinary paper maps to look over possible areas and topographic features that might be interesting. So these are some tools that you can use for planning your shots. If you want to do ocean shots, a tide table that would tell you when the tide is high or low would be another useful thing. So this is the kind of material you have to collect to figure out when, where, what time of night am I going to make these shots. Camera settings, general, you want a wide aperture. You want your white balance. I float between daylight, which gives you kind of a bluish look, or just auto. But I honestly don't worry about this too much because all these shots are going to be in RAW, and you can mess with it. You can mess with white balance in your post production. And a lot of this is like with white balance for these kinds of photos. It isn't like portraiture or product photography. It's nobody else saw the scene. It can only be recorded in your camera, and it's kind of whatever floats your boat. So I tend to like my pictures a little bit bluer, but people have different ideas on how to set their white balances. Raw JPEGs max resolution as you want them, but these have really got to be raw files ultimately to effectively process them in post. High ISO noise reduction, I usually set that in the camera, either medium or high, and kind of just leave it there. And also, let me finish this before I go on to post. There's also setting your camera called long exposure noise reduction. You can't use it for star trails because between every exposure, if they're 15-second exposures, your camera is shut off for 15 seconds to compute the noise reduction. So I think most people don't do this anymore and really rely on software to get rid of noise in their pictures. And with that, again, since I started this in the early teenies, the advances in computer noise reduction have been so gigantic that it isn't so much of a problem anymore. More on camera settings. So these are some suggested ones. For the Milky Way, a typical one might be 2500 to 3200 ISO. On an f1.4 lens, just narrow it up just a bit to get better performance out of your lens. So f1.6. Shutter, as we talked earlier, we don't want smearing stars, so 15 to 20 seconds is pretty typical. So these are pretty typical settings for Milky Way shots. Star trails, it's less demanding on getting light into your camera because your exposures are going to be so long, and the stars that you're trying to get in star trails are not as faint as the dust clouds in the Milky Way. So you can run with lower ISOs, and 2.8 to f5.6 is probably good enough for your aperture. And there's no magic in this. I like 2-minute exposures, and with 92-minute exposures, that gives you 3 hours of star trails. And by that, on my Canon 5D Mark IV, the battery was out by then. I'm getting a little better performance on the Canon EOS R. I probably can go to almost 4 hours on those, but 3 hours seems enough. So I do 2 minutes and at 90 exposures, and that's like a reasonable compromise between having the exposures individually not too long and not having a gigantic number of images to process when you get back home. So a few things on post-production. Denoise, the current rage, courtesy of Roy Patience and Carl Volpe, is to use Topaz denoise. And, but, they're even, Nick denoise and then the organic stuff in Photoshop all works pretty well nowadays. But I would encourage everybody to give Topaz denoise a try. I did it on the picture that I'm going to use in the case study, and it's pretty impressive on getting rid of noise in these photos. So anyway, your first step is probably going to be denoising your pictures. As I said, you can play with white balance. In Lightroom, you could use, an adjustment brush and handle your foreground differently from your sky, if that seemed like an interesting thing to do. So white balance, play with it. You can darken your sky with an adjustment brush, which I usually find is necessary to do to darken the shadows in the sky. And you can brighten the stars with curves, move the extreme white so it's brighter. And so those are some quick suggestions about Milky Way post-production. For star trails, first thing you have to do is stack your exposures. Star stacks or image stacker, and you can also do this with layers in Photoshop. But I use image stacker, and it's a great program. It works well, and it allows you to make certain adjustments to, like, it if you have if your intervalometer, which like mine has an incredibly annoying feature, which the shortest gap is 2 seconds. Image Stacker does a gap filling routine, and you don't see the gap that's left in there. So I would recommend that program, and I can't remember if it's free or if there's a charge, but if it costs money, it's very inexpensive. So you stack your exposures, then same with the Milky Way, denoise them, and fiddle with your white balance, and generally do normal post-production stuff. If you are shooting in a light polluted area, getting rid of the dreaded orange glow on the horizon can be a little bit of a chore, but I think if you try and stay at it, you can at least minimize that kind of a problem. And honestly, some people don't care. They think it makes the photos look interesting, so maybe just leave it in there. So let me do workflow, and then we'll pause again for questions. So first step is to figure out a composition, planning your shot using the tools that we talked about. Figure out your date and time, considering the moon, what percentage full is it, what azimuth is it going to be on when you're out shooting, what position is the Milky Way going to be in relative to your foreground and the moon, if the moon is going to be up. Shoot a dark frame, so that can be useful for, so you have it on this particular set of photos, and that can be useful for denoising. In Image Stacker, the program that's used for compiling star trails, they have a routine in there where it says, if you give me a dark frame, I'll use it to denoise the resulting image. So it's useful. You obviously can shoot a dark frame anytime, but sometimes it's handy to have your dark frame in the same folder. Make your captures, possibly including a separate exposure for your foreground, and do your post-production. So let me pause again for questions. I'll wait like 15 seconds. If I don't hear anything, we'll move on. So any questions? Okay. So other stuff, this is a picture of a Ioptitron Sky Tracker motorized mount. And the biggest reason I showed you this thing is somebody please borrow this thing, so it doesn't sit in my drawer all the time. You know, it's one of these expensive, not actually, it's about $400 several years ago. It expensive electronic toys that the number of times it's used, the half-life of its use diminished quickly. So I haven't used it in a little while, but it is kind of fun, and I've run like 4 and 5 minute exposures of the Milky Way. And when you do that, you can use much lower noise settings, and it resulted in very nice, bright and clean shots. So these are, and since then, a couple of other companies have started making these things that are specifically designed for to mount a DSLR and have it track the sky. If I guess I didn't say this, to be clear, what this does, you see that little cylinder in the lower left side of it? That's a polar alignment scope. So you align your mount on the North Star and then turn the thing on, and your camera moves in the same, exactly mirrors the movement of the stars. So you can make longer exposures without smearing your stars. And it's kind of a fun thing to use, but like I say, if anyone ever wants to borrow this, knock yourself out. I will caution everybody, you can see how awkward it is to look through that finder scope, and the polar alignment is a huge pain in the neck. Can be done because I've done it, but that is a big nuisance in using one of these things. Okay, more other stuff. Compositing. If you take enough of these pictures, you're probably going to be compositing at some point. So brush up on how to get nice, clean masks and composites to combine a sky image and a foreground image. So I'm going to go into some examples, and I'll pause again for questions here. Hopefully I have a volunteer to borrow my Sky Tracker mount. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Let's see. So this is this image was shot in 2014, and for those of you who like to hike in the Eastern Sierras, this is about 3 miles south of the South Lake Trailhead, overlooking Long Lake. And I backpacked out there, and I was actually going to go further, but for a variety of reasons, I just got tired and said, this is good. This scene was good enough. I could see during the daytime it would be a nice composition for the evening. So I found a little high point and climbed up there and set up a tent and waited for it to get dark. This was a night that I was going to have a rising moon about midnight. So I kind of preliminarily composed the image during the day, set up on tripod, waited for it to get dark and the Milky Way to be visible. And I shot probably, I don't know, 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night after it was fully dark. And when the Milky Way had rotated into what I thought anyway was a compositionally pleasing position over those mountains. And I took a picture, again, focused on the Milky Way, and the exposure was set up for a Milky Way shot. And of course, in that picture, the mountains were all just black blobs. So then I plugged in an intervalometer, and I set it to start in about an hour, a little bit before the moon was going to rise, and programmed it to take an image every 20 minutes for a couple of hours. So this image, and I picked and so the moon comes up and it lights up it's a fairly bright moon that night, lights up my foreground, and you can see that the foreground image I selected, the moon is pretty low and coming in kind of at the extreme left side. So I have nice sideline on those jagged peaks in the distance. And then back in post, I took the two images and masked off one or the other and combined them in post. So, this way you have the best of all worlds, a nice, bright Milky Way and a well illuminated foreground. So this is one example of a landscape astrophotograph. And by the way, that image at the beginning of the racetrack, same exact process. I was camping near there with my wife, and we waited, kind of looked around for some rocks. After it got dark and the Milky Way was up, but not the moon yet, we walked out there and had an incredibly hard time finding a rock because it was so dark. But eventually we found one that worked out pretty well, and using headlights composed around it, and shot the Milky Way, and then ran the camera by remote while we went back to bed, and it captured about 8 exposures of the moon illuminating the racetrack playa, and picked the one that seemed to be the best fit and combined them later on in post. So these are kind of just, we're going to call a couple of these just fun with astrophotographs. This isn't really an astrophotograph because it's taken during the day. This was a partial lunar eclipse, partial solar eclipse. And for those of you, again, who hike in the local area, this was obviously before the windmill collapsed in Newbury Park. And I was out there with Allison. I think I put a post on Facebook and said, anybody want to come and fool around with me and taking these pictures? And Allison Barnes turned up and we took some pictures. And the efforts to capture the sun with partially eclipsed were utter failures, but some lens flare and a couple of the images put the moon, the eclipsed sun right in the vein of this windmill. So I thought that was kind of an interesting shot, and processed that. And this is the completed picture. So there's always lunar eclipses. This is one from several years ago, and again, the Astro geeks on the call will remember we had a spate of 4 of these in 2 years, and since then we're sort of in a lunar eclipse wasteland right now, and there's not really a total one coming up for a little while, and it's unfortunately like this where the moon is not in the center of the sun's shadow, but off to the edge. So you can see there's kind of a bright spot off to the top of the moon. But anyway, I set up on tripod and just, these are probably maybe 10-minute or 8-minute exposures, just shot some and put it over this set of peaks. And this is, I think this is in Newbury Park at the Hidden Valley Overlook. I'm not sure. Anyway, fun with lunar eclipses. This is the charcoal kilns on the west side of a Death Valley on Rose Valley Road. So I saw this. My daughter gave me a book about nighttime photography for Christmas a couple of years ago. And I saw some guy did something like this at a different spot in Colorado somewhere. So I said, I can do that. And for $3 a piece, I ordered 10 headlamps, small LEDs, and then got some cellophane, I think, and wrapped it over the LED and put the LED upright right at the entrance and turned them all on after it got dark. And this is a night with a moon behind me. So that's where all the light of the charcoal kilns and the mountain. And before stalling the question, I'm going to pretend that's a meteor over in the left. I don't know if it's a meteor or an airplane.
Looks like a plane to me.
No, it's a meteor. Come on. So anyway, this is another, more fun with nighttime photos. And last but not least, I'm going to do a case study of an image I shot in our own Conejo Valley about 12 days ago. So a Milky Way image in Newbury Park. So things I had to think about. This time of year, it's early in the Milky Way season, and the core which is the photogenic part. That's the part you want in your pictures. The core hasn't risen above the horizon until, at the time I did this, I don't think it was really up until about 1 in the morning. So you have to see, obviously, doesn't pay to go out there at 11 o'clock and wait around for 2 hours. So I had to think about what time of night I was going to shoot. And the first consideration was the core going to be over the horizon. What compass direction is it going to be in? Like, can I put something interesting on the ground that will be in front of the Milky Way? And this is another example of why it's important to ideally be familiar with the area. Like many of us, I've hiked in that area a lot, so I knew pretty much exactly what to expect on how this image would compose itself. Where will I shoot from? Light pollution in the shooting Milky Ways in the Canal Valley is a little bit of an oxymoron almost, but it actually is possible. But I had to be careful about where I would shoot from. And in particular, I hiked in from the trailhead off of Lynn Road, I don't know, about 3/4 of a mile, enough to get a little bit of the pollution, the light pollution from Newbury Park well behind me. And having done this before, the good news about the light pollution was that I knew that there would be enough ambient light to light up the Santa Monica Mountains without worrying about having a moon out. So how can I light a distant foreground? I knew this wouldn't be a problem because of the ambient light behind me. I also needed to be sure that the moon was not up, because I didn't really want a moon in this picture because I already had foreground light and I didn't want it blowing out the Milky Way. Very important for shooting around here. You know, are the skies going to be clear? Are they going to be foggy? And I was looking for a night where we had some offshore flow to blow out the mist and fog that's common in our skies near the coast for a good chunk of the year. So I was also studying the weather. You know, I picked out a window of number of days, and I was following the weather reports to see what that was going to be like. And then last but not least, how much did I really want to get up at 2 in the morning? So that was a big consideration too. Only an Astro Geek could love this screenshot. This is Photo Pills, and I put some notes on this to show some of the really interesting parts of Photo Pills. So it's a mashup of Google Earth and then all kinds of data, astronomical data about the sun, the moon, the rise, what times, what percentage of the moon's disk is illuminated, and most importantly, where is the Milky Way going to be at what time of night? So if you look at the top, the spot that my arrow points to where the dots are bigger, that's the core of the Milky Way. And I already knew that down at the bottom where see the copyright for Google Maps, that's the general direction I wanted to be aimed in to catch some distinctive peaks in the Santa Monica Mountains. But you know, the red dot is movable, so you can move this all around to kind of get an idea of how your picture is going to compose. Most important, or more importantly, below the map picture, you'll see the bar with the white on each side and then the blue in the middle. The blue is nighttime, and you'll see where I'm pointing to the 2:01 a.m. That's a slider, and you can move the dot in the middle of the blue section left and right, and the time changes. As you do this, you'll see the dots in the map rotate around, so you can see at 2:01 a.m. or 3 a.m. or 1:30 a.m. exactly where the Milky Way is going to be. And then over on the right side, you'll see the galactic center and the Milky Way maximum elevation. See the 13.9 degrees? That tells me how high the Milky Way is. And I knew that that would be over those mountains. So I knew that by 2:01 a.m., I would be able to make the shot. The Milky Way would be high enough. It would be in the right position. And the moon, if you look a little higher near the top right, you'll see the moon is setting at 1:52 p.m. So I knew that I would be in good shape on that situation. So I'll pause for questions if anyone wants to mull over this. Roy Patience, feel free to jump in here.
I haven't used photo pills as much lately, but one thing I was going to say to just in the general comment is that the photo pills people have some really good tutorials on their YouTube site.
Okay.
And the other consideration that I always worry about so much with photo pills and photographers ephemeris is making sure that whatever foreground object I have doesn't obscure the Milky Way core, or like the lunar eclipse. That's one of the other big things, is make sure you want to have a nice foreground object, but you don't want to have it obscure all of your Milky Way.
Yes, if you're somewhat, unless you're looking at like a gigantic foreground object and you're close to it, if your Milky Way is, again, see where my arrow is pointing, if that's 10 to 15 degrees, your core is going to be pretty much exposed. And then again, um, if this were a live demonstration, I'd move the blue dot in maybe you can actually see my cursor. I'm not sure. Probably not. But I'd move this blue dot to the to later at night, and you would see that 13.9 begin to increase as the core gets higher. And so if your foreground isn't too high, you're good at least a partial core between 10 and 15 degrees. And if it's really a big foreground object, then you might have to have it a little higher. Okay, I'm going to move on if there's no more questions. So out in the field, I'm thinking about composition. So, even though these landscape astrophotographs are kind of different, the normal rules of composition are still important, and you should definitely be paying attention to them and composing your pictures. Look for a strong land foreground element to complement the stars. So there's some things more than one thing going on in your photo. Make sure the image is balanced. I do see this in a lot of landscape astrophotographs where the Milky Way, the core, is way off to, usually I guess it would be the right side, way off early in the season when the Milky Way is still relatively flat. All the interesting stuff in the picture is way off to the right side. And the image, compositionally, it's not as balanced as it could be, and it can make for a somewhat weaker image. So always be aware, just like in any image, always be aware that the image has balance. This is the end result, and I have a few notes on this. So over on the left side, the field of view, because I'm shooting at 24 millimeters, it's a pretty wide field of view, and it's beginning to be actually over the lights of residences in Newbury Park, Thousand Oaks, I guess. So that area was unfortunately very bright and heavily light polluted, and it took quite a while in post to, you'll see there's not very many stars over there. I was eventually able to darken the area and get a reasonable blend, so at least to my eye, it didn't seem too obvious that I just got in there and darkened a part of the sky. So that was a challenge in post on making this image work. Otherwise, if I hadn't done that, you'd have had the dreaded bright object on the perimeter of your picture, which of course, listening to all of our judges on the monthly meeting judging, we never want that. So that was a challenge. You'll see the cliffs that are the Boney Mountain Ridge. I did have a strong, well-defined foreground object, and the whole scene was pretty well lit from lights coming in from Newbury Park. Um, when I went out there, I was on site by about 1:30, and I first hiked out to the low ridge that's in front of us and shot there for a while. So while I was doing it, the core was steadily rising. And I don't know, to my eye, this image might have been a little better if I'd shot from this particular spot maybe 30 or 45 minutes earlier when the core wasn't quite so high. But, that said, it seemed like it was okay. But the core is in a good compass direction, could have been a little lower. And then without me stepping into the picture to do the self-portrait, this again would have been an image that would have suffered from sort of a lack of balance. And I might have gone so far as to crop it as a vertical picture, because without something on the right side, the picture just, to me, it just didn't seem right. I could have maybe brightened up that field of flowers that I'm standing in front of, but using a human figure, I think, helped balance out the picture. And again, in terms of balancing your pictures, always keep in mind that the human figure counts multiples of natural objects in the picture. So even though I'm relatively small, because it's a human being, it attracts more attention. And again, to my eye at least, I thought the issue about balance in this picture was nicely resolved that way. So let me pause for questions, and then we'll wrap up here. Okay, I'm gonna move on to.
Oh, Pete,
yes.
one last composition idea.
Yeah.
I'm torn between using a horizontal composition like you have here or a vertical composition. And I was wondering if you've thought about the idea of a portrait style composition for Milky Way, since they tend to be kind of vertical sorts of things.
Well, remember that as the season goes on, the Milky Way becomes more vertical. So I shot in this area last summer, like in July, I think. And the Milky Way was much more up and down rather than an angle. And in that case, I just put it off to, I think, to the right side of those peaks, and I composed it vertically. And in that case, I think it made much more sense. So the spring Milky Ways, where the Milky Way is flatter, those usually, or at least right after the Milky Way is rising when it's flatter, those probably on average work out better for horizontal compositions. And when the Milky Way is more vertical, I think it works out better for a more vertical composition. I don't want to flip all the way back there, but if you remember the racetrack photo, that was in the fall when the Milky Way was almost straight up vertical. And I composed that vertically, for that reason. But that's another consideration is the time of your Milky Way season is kind of like early April to October at the latest, and it'll present itself differently during those time periods. And depending on what kind of foreground object you want to shoot next to, that would sort of drive, do I want to shoot in April or May, or do I want to shoot in July and August? I've shot at the bristlecone pines, and because a tree is vertical, it's always seemed that a vertical Milky Way was better. So those shots seem to have worked better actually, I had one of those. That picture that I light painted, that was shot in August, where the Milky Way being vertical kind of mirrored the tree being vertical. So that's another consideration about when do you want to take these kinds of photos.
Oh, that's good advice. Thanks. And the other thing that just occurred to me as you were saying that, as I recall, PhotoPills has an ability to visualize what the Milky Way core is going to look like, so you can see how it changes from laying over toward the left to laying over toward the right, depending upon what part of the season you're in.
Yes, I know it does that, and I just haven't taken the time. I mean, I'll caution everybody about PhotoPills. It's a great, brilliant product, but it's pretty complicated. And there's a pretty long, for me, just to learn how to use it in a basic way was a pretty long learning curve. And I have never, taken the time to go figure out exactly how you do that. But I know you can do that. I think they call it the virtual view or something like that. So that's another way to plan your shots.
Hey, Pete, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. That's what we're here for.
Okay, this is Harrison.
Yes.
I'm wondering about the focusing problem. If I focus on Mount Boney over there, the seems like the hyperfocal issue would resolve the sharpness of the stars. Is that true?
Yes, if you could do that at nighttime. So, even though I had a lot of ambient light here, I don't think your camera would be able to focus on a dark object that far away. So that's the problem that you run into. So the answer to your question is yes. If you could actually obtain focus on Boney Mountain, your stars would be in focus. Because one of the things that helps you on depth of field is there's two things that are in tension with each other. You're shooting at very wide apertures. So that tends to give you a flatter depth of field, right? But you're also shooting with very wide lenses, which tends to give you a longer depth of field. So, I worked this. Actually, I was going to put it in this thing, and I thought it was too much detail. But generally, for 24 millimeters f1.6, I believe somebody can look this up if you want and correct me, but I think you're at hyperfocal with focusing at on a point about 200 feet away. So those mountains would easily put everything in focus, including the stars. But your problem would be getting your focusing system to work on them at nighttime. So you would inevitably, and the stars are when you look at them in live view, those are the easiest things to obtain focus on because you can see them when they're points. And again, if you're out here in the daytime, just go focus on Boney Mountain and remember exactly where your focus mark is and reset that at nighttime, and that would work too.
Thank you. Great answer.
Okay. Anybody else?
One more question. I just wonder the location you shoot the shot at this picture.
Mhm.
How far is that away from the culture center?
Okay, I am parked at the entrance to the parking lots off of Lynn Road. So, the cultural center from the parking lots, if you could get to them, they're all closed now. But if you could get to them, the cultural center is right near there. But there's parking there. If you want to go out and do this yourself, there's parking for about, I don't know, 15 cars, maybe 20 if you got crazy. And of course, at 2 a.m. in the morning, you can trust me, nobody else will be there. So you can just park your car right by the locked gate. And from this image is, you'll see from the locked gate, you walk through the pedestrian passway, and there's a low hill to your right. And I just walked to the top of the low hill and set up there and then walked in front of the camera. So I'm pretty close to Lynn Road in this image. But if you look, see where I have the red provides balance note. If you look at that ridge line, that is less than a mile without too much gain. And again, I wouldn't do this without having thoroughly gone through it during the daytime, but it was easy enough to walk out there with a good headlamp and get to the top of that ridge. And that's a pretty good spot to shoot from too. So I shot from both that night.
Thank you. Because I think most time I got there, always more on left-hand side. I just curious where you were. Yeah. Thank you.
So that's where I am. I'm within 200 feet of the gate that's now locked that goes to the parking lots.
The gate of the main entrance? So
yeah, the gate of the main entrance to the parking lots, that's now locked because of those pesky COVID-19s.
Mhm.
So I'm parked right at the gate and I'm within 200 feet of that.
I see.
So
Thanks.
if you go out there, Lily, you'll see it is pretty obvious. Just walk through the gate and look to your left and you'll see a very low hill. And you walk to the top of the hill, which gives you some elevation, and this scene will look familiar. And again, though, if you want to try it, that ridge line is another pretty good spot to do this shot.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I have your ebook Under the Night Sky, so I will reread it a few times.
Yeah. If anybody wants to um, send me an email, and I'll send you the PDF of the article I wrote for PSA Journal, and that's like an abridged version of the ebook, and it basically has all the same stuff in there, just in more compactly put together.
Sure.
So let's see. I don't think I have any other comments about this picture unless there's more questions.
Thank you very much, Pete. This fantastic presentation.
Okay,
Yeah,
so let's see.
amazing.
More resources. So you can go get my ebook, but my ebook is kind of dated, so that would not necessarily be my first recommendation. So a guy named Grant Collier several years ago wrote Collier's Guide to Night Photography, and that is, I'm not sure where you can buy that from, but you could Google it, and I think it's I have it as an ebook, so you can probably still get it. But the real Bible these days is From Dusk to Dawn by Glenn Randall, and that is available either in hard copy or digital from Rocky Nook. And that is an extremely thorough, detailed, everything you ever wanted to know about this, and pretty well written. And it's a lot of stuff in there, so it can be a little challenging to dig out sort of the basic things that you need to know. But it's a great book and has lots of nice pictures in it. And he's a professional photographer who lives in Colorado, and writes columns for Outdoor Photographer and other claims to fame. So it's a good book. And one thing about his book is there's a lot of good stuff in there about post-production. That stack mode median thing that I mentioned, he describes that in detail, and he has a long discussion about how to do compositing for these kinds of pictures. So I would definitely recommend that book.